Well, welcome everyone to A Chart from the 40s is all you need. It's a Monday morning in Japan, right after the Second World War, and this data team is preparing their weekly business report. And one of their core KPIs is down 7% from the previous week. So the C-level starts screaming. They start to slice and dice their data with as many dimensions as they can. And after wasting a ton of time, they find nothing. It was just random noise. There was nothing to attribute that change to. There was nothing to attribute the change. And a couple of weeks later, the same KPI shows a positive variation, and life goes on. But it will be the last time that they waste their efforts in such way, because they met this guy, which is Walter Schuchard. Walter Schuchard will tell them, there is a way, there is a better way to avoid these pointless searches in advance. And the chart that Walter Schuchard proposed to that team is pretty old, and this kind of surprised me because it's not so popular, or at least outside industrial circles. And I knew nothing about it, and over the course of a week, I started seeing popping up in several unrelated places, in an older book about data visualization that I was reading, in Hacker News, etc. And it was the time to submit the abstract for this talk at the Jay on the Beach, so I went with it, and I will use the opportunity to dig deep into the topic. When you do that, the first consequence is that not even the title is right of this talk. The chart is from the 30s. It was published by Schuchard on 1931, but there is an explanation for my mistake. The thing is that this easy solution to a complex problem, unlike other easy solutions to complex problems, like far-right political groups, this one actually works, and it has people with very good careers behind it. Particularly, the guy in the middle, Edward Deming, I don't know if you know it, but if you don't, he's the father of many management concepts that we still use today. And he used the work of Walter Schuchard in Japan during the Second World War, during the period after the Second World War, to the point that people attribute to him the economic miracle of Japan on that era. But we are going to learn it from a popularizer of that topic, Donald Wheeler, which is here with Edward Deming, which was pretty old at the time. And so Donald Wheeler has 22 books on the topic of statistical process control, not on the chart specifically, but the most important ones are these two. The problem for you is going with these covers on the underground or on the bus. But the first one is the one where you get why should we use in the charts, and the second one, the making sense of data, is the one that has all the details about the chart. In those books, Donald Wheeler tells the story of the president of a shoe company that has this chart on the wall of his office. It's the daily percentage of defective pairs that they are producing, and he claimed that he had that to know how his plan was doing. So somebody went there, and it was like, okay, given this chart, how is your plan doing? And the guy said, well, some days are better than others, which is a non-answer, really. He's not saying anything. He doesn't have a clue of what's going on. And this is the core idea. Donald Wheeler tells us that replying to that question, how are we doing, is difficult because all data presents variation. The processes that we work with have many cause-effect relationships, and those cause-effect relationships cause many variations, but not all variations are equal. Some variations are routine, some variations are consistent over time, the numbers are changing, but the underlying process is not changing, and it is unlikely that those variations have a single cause, a dominant cause. Many things are happening at once, so it's going to be pointless for us to try to research on that. But some variations are exceptional. They can be sudden or they can be maintained over time. They signal that the underlying process is changing in some fundamental way, and there is likely a dominant cause for that variation. And what does he offer to, distinguish that routine variation from the exceptional variation that we should be focusing on? He shows us the X chart. He calls it the has change occurred chart. and it's just your typical line chart, but with some limits compute, in an upper and a lower limit and a middle line, right? So that everything that is between the limits is considered routine variation. It's the variation that you should expect. Nothing is happening really, but if you see points outside, then something exceptional is happening, and it's worth your time to research into what is happening. So going back to the president of the shoe company, the reality is that if we compute those limits in that chart, the picture becomes clearer. There are not good days and bad days. Both good and bad days are part of the same process. And this is the variation he's likely going to experience unless he dramatically changes the process. As your processes evolve, any KPI, those values may go out of the limits, and your process may evolve to some other thing. That is okay. We can simply recompute those limits. This is likely what we will have in a very long-running time series. And the cool thing with this technique is that it's compatible with trend lines and it's compatible with seasonal values. We can also compute the limits, deseasonalizing the values, and computing the limits on it. And this is the core thing, right, about the limits. And the limits are really funny in the case of Donald Wheeler, funny as in fun, and funny as in strange, because one of the first things you notice is that there is some kind of reluctance in telling us how those limits are computed. You are presented this formula. He says, okay, grab 7 to 8 consecutive samples of your process, of your KPI that you want to compute the limits for, and just apply these formulas. The first line and the last line are the upper and lower limits, and the central line is the middle. You have the average of those samples, and you have a factor, 2.6, multiplied by the average moving range. The moving range is the difference between consecutive values of your time series. You are presented with that, and he doesn't want to tell you, he just tells you this thing. He says, this is the way to compute the limits. If a stranger or even a friend offers you another way of computing the limits, just say no. So remember, kids, do not accept sweets from a stranger. And it's super weird. The thing is that he doesn't tell us how they are computed, at least in any of those books, really. But the thing is that it can be shown, it can be proven, that those limits are computed by considering that the metric that you are measuring is a normal distribution. It has a normal distribution of values, and the range of routine variation is the average plus an estimation of 3 times the standard deviation of the distribution of your values. And what he claims is that these values are really pragmatic, and what he's trying to do is to minimize the probability of you losing your time. If you see values outside those limits, the probability that you are looking for something that is not really happening is very small. But then, this keeps on being a bit weird, because Donald claims that you can use this even if the values are not normal. So he wrote, visibly irritated, an article which is called, "Do you have leptocurtophobia?" which is an illness that, according to him, the symptoms are that you are routinely asking if your data is normally distributed and trying to transform your data to appear it more normal. And the article is actually quite good, because what he did is that he did a lot of simulations with a lot of distributions with many different shapes, just to show that the limits still hold, that he doesn't care really about that the limits are precise. What he wants is to minimize the time that you're going to lose if you start researching things that are outside of those limits. For some distributions, the limits may not even make sense, but you have an skewed distribution anyway, and that when you have that, you have a natural limit. It doesn't matter. You are not going to go, for example, that could be a conversion rate. A conversion rate cannot be lower than 0, so you don't care about the lower limit. And in fact, what he explains is that you shouldn't even transform your data into anything, because when you do that, he says that you are doing a statistical voodoo, that what you're doing is that you are assuming that your process is homogeneous, that is not changing, when you precisely want to use the chart to detect if your process is changing into some other way, right? And to me, I was surprised. I obviously remove all the access, and I'm not going to say which metrics are you seeing here. These are real metrics of us. And I find it that this is a very pragmatic tool, very useful. I'm using just for debugging. When I see something weird, I just go into a notebook and compute the limits. And it gives me something to hold on to know what variation I sort of expect, or to detect if something is changing really or not. And that's all, folks. Thank you.